Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello learners. Today's lecture is in continuation of the topic of inflation, which we started in the previous lecture of Unit 3, that is Lecture 1. Our focus of discussion today would be on what are the reasons for inflation or what are the causes of inflation, and thereafter we will also understand that how does inflation has an effect on the economy. So the topic again is causes and effects of inflation. So let us have an outline of today's lecture. We will be understanding, of course, the causes of inflation and the effects of inflation. We will be distinguishing between two very important types of causes of inflation, that is demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Thereafter, we will understand that what kind of a relationship exists between inflation and the interest rates. So just taking you back to what we discussed in the last lecture, we had defined inflation. We had said that inflation is basically a persistent and a rise in the general price level. That is, when on an average, the prices of the goods and services are increasing in a steady and continuous way, we define it as inflation. Now, before we move forward, just think about this situation that I am giving you. Let us say if all of us suddenly are given ₹1,00,000, what would happen? What would be our reaction? Or what would happen in the economy as a whole if all of us suddenly had ₹1,00,000 in hand? What would happen is this would lead to excess supply of the real money balances with all of us over the demand of money. Because there is a sudden influx of money supply, all of us would have extra money supply in hand. And extra money supply would mean that too much money chasing too few goods. So that was the view of the monetarists when they said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, wherein they try to say that when the money supply increases, it automatically directly increases the price level because the supply of real balances of money is more than what people actually demand. So this would lead to inflation. Another situation I ask you is, what are the two things that cause prices to increase? If you remember, when we did our aggregate demand and aggregate supply lecture in the previous unit, we had seen that it is the interaction of demand and supply which determines the price. We had also understood that a change in demand and change in supply leads to an increase in price or a decrease in price. So learners, what does this mean? That what are the two things which have an impact on price? Correct. It is the demand and the supply which is changing the price. So essentially, when we are trying to understand that what causes inflation, if we go by the monetarist view, it is the excess money supply which leads to inflation. How does it lead to inflation? Excess money supply leads to excess supply of real money balances with the people. Real money balances increase over what they had actually demanded. This pushes up the aggregate demand, hence the prices increase. Or on the other hand, if there is a decrease in supply due to any reason, then also there is an increase in price. So these 2 points that we have discussed will take us further to what are the causes of inflation. When we talk about causes of inflation, we will say that inflation, as we have just understood, can be due to the demand pull factors. That any inflation, that is because the demand has increased, that rise in price is known as demand pull inflation. That is, we will be talking about what is demand. We have seen that aggregate demand is composed of consumption expenditure, investments of the firms, government expenditure, and if it is an open economy, then there is a role of exports as well as imports. So any inflation, any price rise which takes place because the demand has increased is termed as demand pull inflation. The second cause of inflation can be due to the supply side. That is, there are certain cost push factors that the cost has changed, hence because of it we see a rise in prices. So any inflation that is resulting because there is a decrease in aggregate supply is known as cost push inflation. So it is the demand and the supply or either of them which are leading to inflation. The third view regarding inflation is with respect to structural rigidities. This view has more come into picture in the 1970s, wherein economists like Mirdal have argued that inflation is in developing economies is not essentially because there are certain rigidities in the economy. There are certain resource gaps in the economy, for example, saving and investment gaps is there. There may be food shortages because in developing economies, agriculture is dependent heavily on rainfall. So any drought, any very excess rainfall or very low rainfall can lead to food shortages, which pushes up the food prices and causes inflation. Similarly, according to them, the structural rigidities like insufficiency of raw materials because these developing economies at many times are not self independent. They are dependent on other nations to supply them the raw material. They have certain foreign exchange issues also, because of this, which they are unable to procure imported raw materials. So such insufficiency of raw materials also leads to inflation. So these structural rigidities, which are particularly true for developing economies, can also lead to inflation. So what causes inflation? Either it can be due to the increase in aggregate demand, which we have seen according to monetarists happens because the money supply increases, leading to have people having more money in their hands. So it pushes up their aggregate demand, which leads to increase in prices. Second, we are talking about cost push factors. Now here cost push factors, I will again like to sum it here is that this cost push inflation, which has resulted from aggregate supply, it has gained ground particularly after the 1950s. Before that, it was considered that inflation is essentially due to the demand-driven factors. It was in the 1950s it was realized that it is the supply side also which is causing inflation. So second factor which can lead to inflation is that due to the aggregate supply changing, a decrease in aggregate supply, an increase in the cost of production, which is termed as cost push inflation, also is a very pertinent cause of inflation. Then with respect to the developing economies, it is argued that structural rigidity, certain built-in bottlenecks are there which prevent the economy to fulfill the demand. Therefore, it leads to increase in prices. What can be those rigidities? It is said that rigidities can be in form of resource gaps. There is a greater need of investments. Savings are less. Hence, resource gap or financial resource gaps get created. Firms are unable to produce more because investment availability is less. Food shortages can occur, or there may be insufficiency of raw materials. Now, let us understand all these factors one by one. We will be starting with demand pull inflation. As we have just seen, demand pull inflation is due to an increase in the aggregate demand. What is aggregate demand composed of? We have seen in Unit 1 as well as in Unit 2 that aggregate demand in an open economy is equal to consumption expenditures, that is denoted by a capital C, plus investment, which is denoted by capital I, government expenditure, which is denoted by a capital G, then exports minus imports. So C plus I plus G plus X minus M is what composes the aggregate demand. Any change in the aggregate demand, any increase in the aggregate demand, which is not compensated by a subsequent increase in supply, leads to inflation. And such inflation we have termed as demand pull inflation. So let us discuss all these factors one by one. So demand pull inflation, as we have just said, it can be because consumption increases. Household starts consuming more. There is demand or more demand of final goods and services. Second reason can be an increase in the investment which is put by the firms. Then increase in the government expenditure or an increase in the net exports. What is net exports? It is exports minus imports. So all the four factors which determine the aggregate demand in the economy, when they increase, this leads to a shift of the aggregate demand curve and it pulls up the prices. So now next question to our mind is that what can lead to an increase in consumption? An increase in consumption can be due to the household incomes have increased. How do households income increase? Households income can increase maybe because the government has decreased the direct taxes. If there is a decrease in, let us say, the income tax rate, the disposable income in hand increases. Because our consumption is directly dependent on how much income we are earning, our demand for various goods increases. So a rising household income, which may be due to decrease in direct tax, leading to an increase in disposable income, will pull up the increased consumption. Another reason for increase in consumption is that people decide to reduce their savings. There may be various reasons as to why they want to reduce their savings, but if they reduce their savings, this means that they have greater money in hand to be spent in the market. Hence, this consumption increases. So this is from the side of households, which pulls up the aggregate demand curve, leading to an inflation. Going to our second component, that is increase in investment. That why do firms increase their investment? Firms might increase their investment because the interest rates have decreased. Again, please try to recall that we have done in Unit 2 that how there is an inverse relationship between interest rates and investments. When rate of interest rises, investment declines. Why? Because interest rate is basically a cost of investment. So when investment becomes cheap, because there is a decrease in rate of interest, it increases the investment. An increase in investment will have multiplier effect on your total aggregate demand and hence your aggregate demand increases leading to inflation. Another reason for increase in investment may be there is an increase in business confidence. There is a general business optimism. Firms feel or they forecast, they expect that the market in whatever we are going to sell, there is going to be tremendous demand in the market. So, because of this positive sentiment that they are having, which we generally see in the recovery phase of your business cycles, business sentiment is very optimistic. So they want to invest more so that they can produce more and sell more. This will lead your aggregate demand to go up and hence may lead to what is called as demand pull inflation. The third factor which leads to a demand pull inflation is increase in government expenditure. If, for example, government feels that there is a recessionary gap in the economy, there is a deflationary gap in the economy, there is a greater potential to produce, but we are producing at a less than potential level of output. So government may try to push up this demand by increasing its own government expenditure, by taking public infrastructure projects maybe running into a budget deficit by spending more and taxing less. So this pushes up the total aggregate demand in the economy, and hence it might lead to inflation. Now, I would like again to you people to just recall that what we had done in your IES curve. We had seen that when the government expenditure increases by use of fiscal policy, and your IES curve had shifted outside, and then we had talked about crowding out. So this increase in government expenditure is something which we have already understood when we did our goods market equilibrium. So this increase in government expenditure can also lead to inflation because there is an excess spending by the government. We are not saying that this is bad for the economy, but we are just trying to understand that why inflation can occur. Fourth reason for increased demand pull inflation can be due to the foreign sector. That is, there is an increase in net exports. I have just told you what is net exports. Net exports is exports minus imports. So if in the foreign countries the demand for Indian goods increase and exports go up, we will see greater aggregate demand because Indian producers will start earning more by selling abroad. Or if the imports decrease due to any reason, the net exports will increase, pushing up the aggregate demand curve, leading to inflation. So these are the four factors or four things which can lead to an increase in price from the aggregate demand side. Now let us see all this shift and whatever we have discussed here in form of a graph. So we have just understood that when we talk about demand pull inflation, we are saying it is too much money chasing too few goods. Why? Because aggregate demand is more than the aggregate supply. This too much money chasing we have already understood is from the point of view of monetarists, or it may be because we've just understood the four factors. Because of the increase in aggregate demand, which is not being fully compensated by similar increase in supply, this AD or aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply. Any increase in consumption, increase in investment, increase in government expenditure will shift your aggregate demand curve to the right. Please go back to the lecture which we have already done in the aggregate demand in the unit 2. If you are not right now recalling, it will become clearer to you if you go back to those lectures and come back here. So the aggregate demand curve shifts to the rise, and we have just said that why does AD curve shift to the right? It can be due to change in consumption, change in investment, change in government expenditure, exports or imports. Now let us see this graph. And we are saying we are measuring price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. We draw an aggregate demand curve which is downward sloping. What does it mean? A downward sloping curve means that when the price levels are more, the demand real GDP is low. Aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. The point where both of them meet, that is your price level equilibrium and equilibrium level of output. So let us say economy is at a point of rest at the equilibrium of PLE and 1E. Due to any of the change in C, I, G, X or N, your aggregate demand curve will shift rightwards. So we see the aggregate demand curve shifting outside like this. So you have a new aggregate demand curve AD1. What do we see, learners? We see that a new equilibrium position is attained where AD1 becomes equal to aggregate supply curve. They become equal at a higher level of price than the previous one, which is PL1. But simultaneously, we also see that your real GDP has increased. So what is the impact of a demand pull inflation? We are seeing that due to a demand pull inflation, the price level has increased as well as the real GDP has also increased. So a demand pull inflation is leading to a shift of the aggregate demand to the right, pushing up the existing price level and also increasing the real GDP. So that is the impact of a demand pull inflation on the economy. Moving forward, let us now understand what is cost push inflation. As I've just mentioned to you, this cost push inflation has taken ground more in 1950s when it was realized that it is not only the demand factors which are leading to increase in prices, but there is something happening on the supply side as well, which is leading the prices to rise. So cost push inflation takes place when the aggregate supply reduces due to or the aggregate supply curve shifts due to any of the following factors which we are going to discuss. What are those factors? Your cost push inflation can be due to a material cost change, which is called as material cost push inflation. Let us say the input prices increase. When there is an increase in input prices, it will automatically push up the cost of production. Therefore, aggregate supply curve will shift inwards or shift leftwards, and this will push up the prices. Second reason can be profit push. This is something which is only related with the firms, with the entrepreneurs who are running this business. If the businessman feels that the current rate of profit that they are earning is not sufficient for them, they may like to keep a greater profit margin. A higher profit margin would mean that the prices as such will reduce. The prices will increase. I'm sorry for that. Profit push means that the firms, when they are expecting that what profit percentage they earn is not as much as what they should be. They want to earn greater profits. So in order to earn greater profits, they either reduce the supply or they increase the price because they are changing the aggregate supply curve. So that is the profit push. Then another reason for cost push inflation can be a supply shock. A sudden decrease in the supply of raw material will push up your aggregate supply curve inwards, which will increase your total equilibrium price. Another reason for cost push is identified as wage push. That is, when labor unions or when the workers demand higher wages for the work that they are doing, this will increase the prices for the firms. So either they will be able to supply less at the original price, or they will supply the same amount at a higher price. So all these four factors can lead to cost push inflation, which is essentially from the producer side, unlike the demand pull factors, which was from the consumer side. So cost push inflation can be because of an increase in the input prices, because businessmen now start desiring higher profit margins, so it can be a profit push. It can be because there is a supply shock, an important raw material or the raw material which is being used by most of the firms, there is a decrease in the supply of that raw material. Hence, there is an increase, your aggregate supply curve or aggregate supply decreases. Or it can be from the point of view of the workers, that in long run they bargain for greater wages. A higher wage rate would then lead to a cost push inflation. Now let us see graphically this cost push inflation. Unlike the demand pull inflation, the cost push inflation will have an impact on the aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve, in case of cost push inflation, will shift inwards. We have already done this also in your unit 2, but now we will be understanding the same concept from the point of view of inflation. So, when we are talking about cost push inflation, what we are saying is that the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left or it shifts inward. Why does it shift inwards? It shifts inwards because there is a rise in the cost of production. Now let us make this graph. Let us say that this is your aggregate demand curve. shown by the blue line. You have an aggregate supply curve which is upward sloping. We are of course measuring your price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. They meet at a point where your equilibrium is at PLE and output is YE. What do you think would happen to the AS curve if we are talking about the cost push inflation? This curve, that is the aggregate supply curve, will shift leftward or inward to AS1. Demand remaining the same, if there is no change in the demand, what we will see is that there is an increased price at PL1. Price level has gone up from PLE to PL1 and your real GDP has decreased from YE to YE1. So what has been the impact of cost push inflation? Cost push inflation has decreased your real GDP, but it has also increased your price level. Unlike what we did in demand pull, we saw because of a demand pull inflation, price level of course increased, but side by side we also saw that your real GDP increased. But in cost push inflation with an increase in price, we are also suffering loss of the real GDP. That is, your equilibrium level of output has fallen from the higher level YE to Y1. So what do you think this will do? Cost push inflation is definitely less desirable or needs to be controlled more than the demand pull inflation, because it is of course putting pressure on our price level in form of increased price, but it is also reducing the level of real GDP, which would mean translate into lower level of employment. So that is the impact of your cost push inflation. Now, another very important and very interesting type of factor which contributes to the cost push inflation is known as wage price spiral. We have just seen when we discussed your cost push inflation, what factors impact your cost push inflation. We have said that wages is one reason, increased wages, wage cost is one reason for cost push. Continuing with the same, we have a very interesting concept of wage price spiral, as you can see in this figure, that the wages are increasing, then prices are increasing, so it's becoming like a spiral. What is this spiral? Let us understand. Basically, a spiral means it's a perpetual process. It's an ongoing process. What ongoing process? Let us say if workers feel that the price level in the economy are rising, to compensate them so that they feel that their real wages should not fall, they demand a raise, in their wages. And generally, owners increase prices to pay for the raises. That is, if employers, if they want to pay higher wages to the workers because workers demand these wages, they will pass on this cost to the consumers in form of increased prices of whatever goods and services they are offering. So what has happened is, it has started with workers demanding a raise. A demand in raise, the owners will pass on this cost to the customers by way of increased market price of whatever they are producing. High price causes workers to demand further higher raise, because now workers go in the market and see the overall average price level in the economy has increased. So they again go back and ask for greater raises. A higher raises, again owners increase the price and pay for the higher raises. Again, high prices cause workers to demand for higher raises, and owners again increases prices for higher raises. This means that this is going like a spiral. The goods are going with the prices. What is happening to the prices? Workers are demanding a raise, wages increase. Wages increase, because of that owners increase the price. Prices increase, workers realize the average price level has increased, they again demand for a rise. So it becomes something like a spiral. Therefore, inflation in such case becomes a perpetual process. So that is one aspect again which is very worrisome sometimes, because if you do not compensate the workers also, then also it leads to a loss of welfare, but again, always giving into the demand of their wage raise will lead to a higher inflation. Now, after understanding the concept of what causes inflation, we have understood demand pull and cost push. We have understood that how wage price spiral takes place. Very important concept and very interesting concept which all of us somewhere or the other use in our real practical life is the concept of interest rates and inflation. There are two types of rate of interest which we talk about. One is called as a nominal interest rate and other is called as a real interest rates. For example, you go to the bank and ask them that I want to deposit, let us say, a few lakhs of rupees for a term, for a fixed term. For example, you go to the bank and ask them that what is the rate of interest which you will offer to me if I make a fixed deposit of, let us say, 2 years. So banks tell you, okay, we'll pay you a rate of interest of 5% or 6%. So the rate of interest which the bank is paying you on whatever deposits that you are making is known as your nominal rate of interest. It is known as your nominal rate of interest, which we are going to denote by small I. Another thing we have already understood earlier also is the concept of real. Now with this nominal rate of interest which you are getting, there is also a rise in the prices which is taking up. There is an inflation which is always there in the economy which we have already seen. This inflation rate will reduce the value of your money. We have understood in the last lecture that how inflation reduces your purchasing power or how the value of money reduces due to inflation. So if you are being offered a rate of interest, a nominal rate of interest of 6%, you will compare it with the rate of inflation which is in the market right now. And then say, let me now check that how much actually this rate of interest will give to me. So the actual purchasing power which the nominal rate of interest is giving to you after discounting for this inflation rate is known as the real rate of interest. So three terms which we are understanding here is, one is nominal interest rate, second is real interest rate, and third is inflation rate. I will again repeat this for you. Nominal interest rate is that which the bank is paying you if you go to the bank and deposit any sum of money. Inflation rate is the increase in prices which we see every day, which we read in the papers, that is the rate of inflation. We all know that inflation reduces the value of money. So if there is a rate of inflation going on, automatically the money which you are going to earn from the bank by way of this nominal interest rates, its value will also go down. So how much the inflation has an impact on your nominal interest rate is measured by what we call as real interest rates. So this real interest rate is basically telling the consumer that what purchasing power he or she will have with the interest they are going to earn. These three terms can be put in a form of an equation, which is, let us say, R is equal to I minus pi, where R is what? R is the real rate of interest, real interest rate. I is the nominal interest rate and pi is the rate of inflation. What does it indicate? It indicates that the real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So this means that this inflation rate is having an impact on your real rate of interest, because real rate of interest is measuring your purchasing power. So the real interest rate is the difference between what? It is the difference between nominal interest rate represented by small I here and the rate of inflation. If we rearrange this, we can say that nominal rate of interest is equal to real interest rate plus the rate of inflation. This equation is known as the Fischer equation. The Fischer equation states that nominal interest rates can get affected by either real interest rates or by the rate of inflation. Why? Because nominal interest rates are determined keeping into mind that what is the rate of inflation and what is this real interest rates. That is what you mean by Fischer equation. So what is Fischer equation? Fischer equation is giving you a relationship between nominal interest rates, real interest rates and inflation rate. What does this equation say? This equation says that nominal interest rate is equal to the real rate of interest or real interest rate plus the inflation rate. This nominal interest rate, in other words, means that it is dependent on the rate of inflation and the real rate of interest. So Fischer equation we have just said it is nominal interest rate is equal to real interest rate plus the rate of inflation. What does this equation show? This equation shows that the nominal rate adjusts to the rate of inflation to keep the real interest rate constant. For example, we want to make sure that the depositor at least earns 4% in real terms. So if the real rate of interest is fixed at 4%, whatever be the rate of inflation, that if this changes, then this your nominal rate of interest would also change. Let us say I am saying the real rate of interest is 4%. If the rate of inflation is 2%, we'll get a nominal interest rate of 6%, so that your purchasing power remains intact. If your rate of inflation goes up to 3%, then nominal rate of interest, keeping your real interest rate constant at 4%, nominal rate of interest becomes 7%. So 7% in 1% increase of nominal interest rate has been due to the change in the rate of inflation. So this adjustment of nominal interest rate to the inflation rate is known as Fischer effect. So learners, what is Fischer effect? Fischer effect is basically telling us that the nominal interest rate keeps on adjusting to the rate of inflation such that the real interest rate remains constant, so that we do not make the depositors worse off than before. So in order to keep their purchasing power constant, the change in nominal interest rate which takes place due to the change in inflation is known as the Fischer effect. Fischer equation and Fischer effect have been given after this name has been given after the name of the economist who has talked about this particular concept. Now, once we have understood that what is inflation, what causes inflation, of course, what we all know is that inflation reduces the value of money. This means there is certain cost which is associated with inflation. We know inflation erodes the value of money. Your purchasing power reduces. Therefore, to the society, there is some cost which is involved. And when we want to understand that what is the cost which is involved in this inflation or due to this inflation, we divide it into two types. One is called as the cost of anticipated inflation and other is known as the cost of unanticipated inflation. So, what we are saying is that inflation is reducing the value of money. It is eroding the value of money. Therefore, in the society, there will be some type of a adverse effect that we measure by dividing this cost in two heads. Cost of anticipated inflation and the cost of unanticipated inflation. Now let us understand the concept. What is the cost of anticipated inflation? Anticipated in simple words means expected. Whenever we get into any type of a contract, or whenever we when we invest somewhere, or whenever we make any financial decisions, we always have a certain inflation rate in mind. We are expecting, for example, I expect that inflation rate today is 4%, probably it will remain the same in the future. So there is certain expectations with respect to inflation rate, and we make our decisions in consideration to this expected inflation rate. So when we are expecting that what would be the rate of inflation, it entails certain costs. First cost is called as a shoe leather cost. Now this is a metaphor which is used, shoe leather cost. It says it is the costs and inconveniences of reducing money balances to avoid inflation tax. Now what is inflation tax? When your inflation increases, it reduces your value of money, so it is type of a tax to you. Now, if you are anticipating an inflation, if you are expecting the prices to rise by 4%, no rational person would like to keep the cash, whole amount of money as cash with them. They would, because they know an empty, keeping cash at home would not only erode the value of their money, it will reduce the purchasing power of their money. So probably we all of us would make a decision, okay, we'll keep some amount of money as liquid cash. Rest of us, let us keep that money in the bank, because at least we will be beating this inflation rate by earning some rate of interest in the bank deposits. But if your anticipated rate of inflation is there and you have kept that money in the bank, the shoe leather cost says that there is certain inconvenience to you, because every time if you need extra money, you have to travel to the bank and get that money, because your cash money balances are low. So you have to go to the bank and withdraw that money. This means that this inconvenience, or the because you go to the bank very frequently, if this anticipated inflation rate is high, your leather shoe gets deteriorated. So there is a cost associated with that. It's just a metaphor which is given to you. That is, it is basically the inconvenience which is caused because you are keeping low money balances with you, because you feel that if you keep high cash balances at home with you, you are eroding the value of money due to this inflation. So you keep more money in the bank, and this cost, which are the inconvenience which you get because you're keeping less money as cash balances and more money in the banks and traveling to the bank every time to withdraw that money or deposit any extra cash you have, is called as the shoe leather cost. The second that we have is the menu cost. We have already discussed in your aggregate supply. What is menu cost? It is the cost of changing prices or the cost of printing new menus. Companies or the firms or restaurants or they print their price tags keeping certain inflation rate in mind. Now, if anticipated inflation is there, if this would mean that they have to automatically keep on changing the prices in their menus very frequently if they anticipate the inflation rate to change very frequently. So, printing of new menus entails a cost that is called as your menu cost. Then another important is this macroeconomic inefficiency in resource allocation. That is, when we are saying that the menu costs are there, that is, if there's anticipated inflation rate is changing very fast, the companies avoid always printing menu because it also entails a cost. But because of this, what happens is that I do not want to change the price right now in short run, because I feel that changing the price would again cost me money for printing those tags. But relatively to my price, the price level in the economy has changed. This would lead to more microeconomic inefficiencies because resources will be allocated in a non-efficient way. Something which should have been cheaper is still being charged more, or something which should have been expensive, this money is getting diverted to some other good because the relative price of that good is lesser than this good. So that leads to a macroeconomic inefficiency. Another problem of anticipated inflation or the inflation is inconvenience of living. Why? Because inflation makes it very hard for you to do long-term financial planning. If today at the age of 40 I decide that I will retire after 20 years and I would need certain amount of money to take care of my old age, but I cannot always correctly anticipate that what would be the inflation rate in next 20 years. Hence it becomes very difficult for me to plan and save for long term. So this makes me, there is always an uncertainty with attached with me. So this inflation has an adverse impact on my long-term financial planning. So these are basically the cost of anticipated inflation, something which you are expecting and making your decisions accordingly. But the cost of anticipated inflation is still not as bad as the cost of unanticipated inflation. As the name is indicating, unanticipated inflation means an unexpected inflation rate. In anticipated inflation, what we had seen is that consumers, workers, employers, they have a certain inflation rate in mind, and keeping that in mind, they are fixing their prices, they are making their wage decisions, they are making their consumption decisions. But if your inflation rate is more than what you had expected, that has a greater cost. That is known as cost of unanticipated inflation. This is basically the cost of unexpected inflation. What does happen here is the first effect of this unanticipated inflation is arbitrary redistribution of wealth between debtors and creditors. That is, because it is an unexpected inflation, people who have lent money and people who have borrowed money, between them the redistribution of wealth is not unbiased. It is arbitrary. There is no clear logic behind it. Why? Because if today I lend somebody money thinking that the rate of inflation is 4%, going to be 4%, and hence I charge them 6% rate of interest, and they return me that money after a given period of time, but they are paying me this 6% rate of interest because I have anticipated an inflation rate of 4%. But due to unexpected factors, this inflation rate becomes, let us say, instead of 4%, it rises to 6%. If it does that, this means for me, I have not earned anything because 6% is the rate of inflation and 6% is the rate of interest which my borrower is going to pay to me. So for me, it is going to be a loss. So this would mean that the debtors and creditors, for them, one would gain and other would lose. The person who has lent the money thinking that the rate of inflation would be less, but unanticipated inflation rate was more, to the lender it will be a loss, but to the borrower it would be a gain. Why? Because he has to pay in real terms, he will pay back lesser amount. Then there is also an adverse effect on the people who are earning fixed wages or pensioners, because their wages do not change, their wages are fixed, keeping anticipated rate of inflation in mind. Now, if there is unexpectedly high rate of inflation, people who are earning fixed amount of money, people who are drawing pensions, their pensions or their fixed amount of wage will not change in respect to the unanticipated inflation. So in real terms, these people will stand to get adversely affected because of this unanticipated inflation. Similarly, there will be an increased uncertainty. Why? Because I am not sure that what is going to be the rate of inflation. Hence, people who are risk averse, people who do not want to take more risk, people probably risk averse people are the ones who are going to invest in banks where they are going to get that particular rate of interest for sure. They may not be liking to go and invest in the share market where the rate of return is not guaranteed. But when there is unanticipated inflation, such people tend to get worse off because their bank's rate may not change so much as this unanticipated inflation rate has. So whether it is inflation is anticipated or anticipated, there will be some adverse effect due to this particular inflation rate. Now, I will give you a small quiz and we will try to identify in which of the following which people are going to get helped, that is, who is going to gain and who is going to lose because of the unanticipated inflation. So, let us see these one by one. Let us take the case of a man who has lent rupees 500 to his friend in 1960 and is still waiting to be paid back. So there's a man who had lent out 500 to his friend long back, 50 years, 60 years back, and is still waiting to be paid back. So who is going to gain and who is going to lose? In this case, the man who has lent is going to lose. Why is he going to lose? Because he still not got that money, and in last 60 years, the value of this 500 may have become almost zero. But the friend who borrowed this money 60 years back, he will gain. Because in real terms, the value of this 500 is almost very low. This is what we hear from our parents also many times, that earlier times 100 rupees used to buy a lot of things. Today 500 rupees has no value. So over a period of time, the person who had lent, because of that, this man who had lent is losing. He's going to hurt by this unanticipated inflation, and the friend is going to gain. Second, a tenant who is charged rupees 850 rent each year. If there's a tenant who is paying rupees 850 rent each year without any change, who is going to lose and who is going to gain? In this case, tenant is going to gain because for him inflation has had no impact, whereas for landlord it is a loss, because irrespective of what has been the inflation rate, he is only has charged 850 because probably he had certain anticipated rate of inflation in mind when he had charged this, when we had fixed this 850 as rent. Then let us take the case of an example of an elderly couple who are living on their retirement payments of rupees 2000 a month. We have just seen fixed income earners and pensioners lose. So this elderly couple is going to lose because of this unanticipated inflation, and pension paying authority will gain. Last case, a man that borrowed, let us say, 1000 in 2001 and paid it back in 2021. So 1000 rupees borrowed in 2001, paid back after 20 years. Who earns? Unanticipated inflation rate is there. Bank might have charged a rate of interest keeping anticipatory rate of inflation. But here unexpected inflation rate is there. So the man who had borrowed has helped because of this unanticipated inflation, and the bank will lose. So this is how unanticipated inflation rate has a greater impact and negative impact rather than anticipated inflation. Reason being, anticipated inflation we take into account whenever we are taking any decisions, whereas because it is unanticipated inflation, it cannot be accounted for. So let us summarize today's lecture. What we have done is, we have understood that what causes inflation. We have said inflation can be due to demand side or supply side. Then we understood that the demand pull is because there is an increase in the demand and the corresponding increase in supply is not there. Whereas supply push or cost push is because there is a decrease in aggregate supply. We also understood the relationship between interest rates and inflation rate, which was given by Fischer equation. What is Fischer equation? It said nominal rate of interest is equal to real rate of interest plus the inflation rate. Then we have seen that inflation adversely affects people. Inflation, when we understand the effects of inflation, or what we also called as the social cost of inflation, it can be anticipated or unanticipated inflation rate. Anticipated inflation rate, we saw that the cost can be something which we have already accounted for, but still it adversely affects us. Unanticipated inflation rate, we said, definitely affects more than the anticipated rate of inflation. So I'm sure learners, this must have been an encouraging and a good learning experience for you about the rate of inflation. Try to use these concepts in your daily life and see that how interesting it becomes for us, the concept of inflation and how it impacts all of us every day at every point of life. So thank you very much. Stay safe, stay happy.